Welcome back, everyone, for our final session. It is a panel discussion connecting to our theme of motivation to learn, the role of motivation in the science of learning. And I just want to introduce our panelists. First is Stephen Pan from National University of Singapore, Stephany Ray from UT Austin, Mayu Nishimura. She is a psychology professor, a colleague of mine right here in psychology, neuroscience, and behavior at McMaster University. And our final panelist is Arnav. He is one of our top undergrad students. He also is a teaching assistant in my introductory psychology course. And coming up in the fall, he will be one of our two head TAs that help to run all of our tutorials and so many different aspects of our course. So thank you very much for joining us on the panel. The first question that I have for our panel is the role of motivation in the science of learning. How do social, cultural, and intrinsic, extrinsic motivations influence student engagement and retention in learning? And why don't we start off with Stephen? Let us know your thoughts on this question.
Well, my thoughts really go to my experience having worked and lived in the United States versus, say, Asia, Singapore, and there are different values that cultures place on education in terms of its role in society, in its role in shaping a person's future. And so when I think of social cultural differences, I think about the different kinds of pressures and expectations that parents place on their children to perform and to do well in class. And the centrality of that, particularly in Asia, and the pressure on that being more important than pretty much anything else, I think is a huge source of, shall we say, external motivation to really push learners to do well, to succeed in courses. Whereas, for example, in the United States and other Western cultures, I think it is less of that single-minded focus on academic performance. And then it might be more of a matter of the intrinsic motivation, what person wants to do in their life by themselves rather than society placing pressures on them to perform. So that's what I would think as the
So if I could just quickly ask a question, just because I was so fascinated by everything you told me about Singapore, how do you think these different types of motivations play out for students in Singapore versus, say, United States?
I think that it results in, particularly in Singapore and probably other Asian countries that have similar value systems, the learners tending to have much more pressure, their self-esteem being tied to their academic performance, and they're feeling that they must succeed in their courses at not necessarily at all costs, but certainly they should leave no stone unturned to do as well as possible, work as hard as possible, because that's in some cases, the only thing that matters. Whereas in the United States, I don't think it's quite that, again, single-minded. And there's, the culture emphasizes different things, a more well-rounded kind of perspective. I'm not trying to pass a value judgment on which cultural norms are better, but I'm just pointing out that when I see the differences, it manifests in that way.
Okay. Stephany?
Yeah, I definitely can think of many things related to social culture and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation that influence learning and students' engagement in the classroom. But your thoughts on the cultural differences made me think about some of my own experiences as a Brazilian, studying there my whole life, experiencing some college in Brazil, and then moving to the United States and earning my bachelor's degree. There, I can definitely notice a lot of the pressures that I had in both different scenarios. So, for example, I grew up being told by many teachers, my parents, and a lot of my peers that asking for help is kind of a sign of weakness, right? Whereas moving to the US and starting going to college, professors were so often telling me, if you have any questions, seek help. We have learning centers. We have office hours. We have tutors. So those things definitely shaped the approaches that I had for my own learning experience in different contexts. In Brazil, also at the university level, grades don't have as much pressure as the amount of pressure that I experienced in the United States. Getting a 4.0, I was so obsessed with it. All my peers were obsessed with it, to the point where we kind of forgot the goal of being in the classroom. Whereas in Brazil, I felt like because we had less of that pressure, I was able to really think about my career and the things that I was learning that would be useful for my career. But in the United States, in the classroom, the culture was just so focused on the grades that I kind of had to remind myself often that, okay, even if I get a B, which is crazy to think about, like B is a good grade, but yeah, I had to remind myself that getting a B would be totally fine. It wouldn't matter that much as long as I was learning the things that I wanted to learn, right? So yeah, just from my own experience, I can, list many things that social, cultural, and even my own motivation influenced the way in which I approached my learning.
So is there of those two environments, was one better for you?
It's hard to say because I didn't enjoy the classes that I was taking in college in Brazil compared to the classes that I was taking in the United States. And I was older too. I feel like we could have less great pressure on grades in the United States.
Okay.
That's what I was saying.
And Mayu?
Yeah, so I agree with what both speakers have said so far, and that absolutely sociocultural factors impact student engagement. The retention and learning is an interesting one. I feel like my intuition is that you have to be intrinsically motivated to learn in a way that the knowledge stays with you and that you continue to use that knowledge. But from a developmental perspective, like the whole institution of learning and education is fairly new in our evolutionary history. Our brains weren't designed to imprison children in a building for 6 to 7 hours a day, right? Our brains were designed to learn by doing and being with other people. So from that perspective, it's our sociocultural values that have created this system in which we expect learning to happen. But at the same, so because our brains were not naturally designed to learn in this way, I do think there has to be external structure and pressure to kind of guide what might be our intrinsic desire to just play with our friends or go chase that butterfly, to sit and pay attention. But then the cultural and societal values kind of help you internalize those external expectations and structures to be part of your intrinsic motivation. Like, if you were stranded on an island by yourself, would you still try to learn everything if you were given a textbook? Probably. Like people here, probably, right? But we probably didn't start off that way. So it has a big impact. And I do think that the society in which you grow up in, the family that you grow up in, absolutely guides how you engage with your learning.
Okay, we actually have someone on the panel who's on the receiving end of all of these things that we've built up. So Arnav, tell us your perspective.
Yeah, I think I agree with what everyone said in that, like, your sociocultural environment and your intrinsic and extrinsic motivation kind of set your baseline of how motivated you are, right? Like if you come from a society that really like specifies and emphasizes getting good grades, you'll be very motivated to do that. If not, then you're not. And I think that you can, like Dr. Mayu said, teach motivation. It is something that you are able to do. But I also think that sometimes retention and learning and motivation aren't like, they don't go hand in hand. Like you might be very motivated to get a good grade in a class, but that doesn't mean you're going to retain everything you learn or that you even want to retain everything you learn. And you could be someone who is taking a class for fun and doesn't want to get a good grade and has no motivation to do that, but you still have that intrinsic, motivation to retain everything you learn. And you might retain far more than the person who, aces the class but didn't really want to learn.
So if someone doesn't have intrinsic motivation, do you think we can somehow get them to have more intrinsic motivation?
I think you can. I think you can kind of like
if a professor, I find that sometimes in a course if a professor is very motivated and super passionate about the content they're teaching, it kind of like osmosis goes through to the students and like they become passionate. Like like there's been a stats course I took or like neuroanatomy where before that I didn't really have much interest in those topics, so I didn't think I did. But through like the just the pure charisma and like passion of the professor teaching it, it's like, wow, like this is actually very interesting. There's a lot to learn here. And then like kind of develop that intrinsic motivation, and then that leads to maybe better grades or better performance or more retention.
Yeah, and to give a homegrown example, one of the names I hear a lot is my colleague, Dr. Goldreich. So he teaches neuroanatomy, and it could definitely be one of those courses that people just don't really like stats. But students routinely tell me that one of the things they love the most is just how passionate he is and how you really feel like a fire lit under you to learn more about it, even though it's a 3-hour night class as well. Okay, let's move on to our second question. We just heard a lot about AI and new tools. I'll throw in gamification there. So Stephany, maybe we can start with you on this question. And I said myself that I still feel like I'm underutilizing some of these tools. But what are your thoughts on how can personalized learning technology and gamification enhance motivation and engagement?
That's a great question. AI and the help of AI is something that I want to learn more about. Like you, Joe, I am interested in utilizing it in a more efficient way for my own personal gains, like help with study designs, like you have used before that you presented. I'm so interested in using those platforms for my own benefit. So I think that that's what we should be doing when we think about students as well. They might already be using this. A lot of have been doing some focus groups interviews with undergrad students, and they tell me a lot about the tools that they're using. Like on Quizlet, if you pay for it, you can upload a PDF file and ask Quizlet to come up with a bunch of questions. That's great when the professors are not providing students with practice problems, for example, and they still want to do some type of self-testing, right? So I think that moving forward, technology and gamification will definitely be used to enhance learning. With all that being said, I also think that we do need to be careful to not overutilize those things, that we kind of start losing some of the relationship and connections that we are creating with students, but also being careful and helping students to use those tools in a more efficient way. So rather than just, letting things happen and let students use those things on their own, maybe we can walk through together these changes with students so we both learn from each other and we do that in a more effective way.
And Mayu.
I haven't thought as much about personalized learning technology, but I would be against gamification if I had to choose a position, because I think of like the social media platforms have already perfected the gamification and personalized algorithms so that the content is most exciting and relevant for you, and students think they're going to be on it for 10 minutes and then 2 hours have gone by. So the algorithms are out there to personalize content that is most exciting and relevant for you. Are those students learning? I don't think so. And our department right now has a summer book club, and we're reading Dopamine Nation. And, from a neurochemical perspective, just that addictive part about gamification is exciting, but overloading your system with dopamine and reward hormones, I think is the opposite of the discussions we heard earlier about learning being difficult and effortful. So I don't think we need to so using gamification to engage like class, camaraderie, like making it a fun environment, absolutely. But I think that's the social aspect of learning. I don't think it really helps with the learning per se. It becomes a game for the purpose of winning the game and not really learning.
Okay. How about Arnav? Do students want technology and gamification in their learning?
I think they do, but I think it's like gamification is, I think, it's a way to get students engaged, right? But I think students, and they want to be engaged, right? Like I enjoy a class and I'm engaged in more than a class I'm not. But I think gamification can be, like, it's not the best way to get students engaged. Like Dr. Mayu said, right? Like I can be scrolling on Instagram Reels or TikTok and be watching educational videos. And after that, I don't really remember anything. And it's the same for like my friends as well, right? You might be thinking that you're learning, but you're not really remembering those educational videos you're watching online. But I think technology can be very useful, right? Like you said, like Stephany said, like it's, once you get the right technology, it can reduce that burden of like, oh, I don't have to worry about remembering when all these due dates are because I have them in a calendar. Or like it can help, I guess, trim the fat of all the work that students have to do and let them do the actual, the real work that they can do. But there's also an idea of, right, how do you set up these technologies? And like there is a kind of startup cost to like finding a new technology and like getting it up and running and setting it up for students and like having them do it themselves, having the professor do it. So it's like hard to kind of figure out what works best for each course or each scenario.
Okay. And how about you, Stephen?
Well, in terms of trying to improve motivation, I think there are many interesting possibilities with personalized learning technologies. You can think about adapting the pace of instruction to align with how well the learner's actually mastering the material. You can think about providing personalized feedback, how well they're doing, maybe even encouraging messages, things like that. That would not be possible if you didn't have technological solutions in place that could, really reach individual students and really take perhaps in real time data on how well they're doing. And so there's a lot of possibility of changing the learning experience with personalized learning technologies to make the learning process smoother, more adaptive, and maybe even more reinforcing in positive ways that could improve the student's level of motivation. Now, in terms of gamification, I hear about the potential downsides, and I agree that gamification is not a sort of endpoint in terms of enhancing learning, but as the social aspect, and also in terms of social aspects to perhaps makes learners more motivated, but also just to change the learning scenario to be one in which there is a clear objective goal and that there are near-term goals that they can achieve in a fun way that may also help with their motivation.
I'll give one example from my introductory course where I guess it's sort of gamification, where I do use audience response systems to ask questions in the lecture. And when I first did it, my thought was, I'm going to make these worth a certain percentage of their final grade. And then when I did that, as you might imagine, students would and they would kind of argue some of the questions. And what I did was instead, I made them for bonus points. So every time you get a question right, you receive a bonus point. And so I do two-stage collaboration. The first, whatever answer you put, you'll get a point just for participating. Then you have to discuss with your peers. And now the correct response will get an additional bonus point. And then those points are redeemable at the end of the year for dropping your lowest quiz grade. Then the next tier, drop your 2 lowest quiz grades, drop your lowest participation grade. And by the way, these are things that we used to give out for free back in the day. But now we tie them to these points, and it seems to really work. They seem to really like this and value the points. But I'll move on to our next question. How does the learning environment, both physical and virtual, impact student motivation and learning? And this time, can we start with Mayu?
So this is an empirical question for me. So I really want to kind of try to do more subtle measures of the difference of being in person as opposed to virtual. So I think there is a place for the virtual aspect and the accessibility and flexibility, but I don't think it compares to the actual learning in person for a lot of the things that I don't think we have captured well. So certainly, social psychologists would know about the bystander effect, where your thinking is different when you're in a group versus individually. And there are animal studies to show that adolescent mice will drink more alcohol when in the same cage as other peers, but not adult mice. So like just the mere presence of other people being in the room, whether it's, pheromones, but all of our senses, vision, hearing, tactile, olfactory, I think everything is registering that, and it raises our arousal and primes our brain to pay attention. I think whether that arousal is directly relevant to the learning or the content or not, I do think there are lots of physiological changes that are happening that we haven't quite captured. And we were quick to, message that online learning is just as good during pandemic lockdowns. But I think if given the choice, they are very different. And I think we need to be more mindful about understanding that difference and communicating that to our students, because we would all rather just join this conference in bed with just a tablet there. But I think, we kind of recognize somewhere that it's not quite the same. And I think we should do more research in terms of what's not the same and let the students know that the outcomes are likely different.
Arnav, I think you went through the pandemic, so you had experiences online and in person. So what are your thoughts?
I actually completely agree. I think that it was a lot more convenient, a lot more accessible, a lot more comfortable to attend lectures and tutorials virtually. But I learned way better in person, because in person, you do have that social effect of all your other peers, right? If you look around and every single person beside you is paying attention, you're going to want to pay attention. And you're also far less likely to get distracted, right? Sure, if I'm in an in-person lecture, I do still have my computer in front of me, but I don't it's the person is speaking right there in front of you. You don't want to, tab out or minimize the window or what have you. So it's a lot less distracting as well. And I think it's easier for the professor, the teacher, whoever is teaching you, to convey through body language, right? When you're seeing that virtual screen, it's just the top, shoulders and up, and you don't get that same body language, right? It does make a really big difference, even though it might be something that you don't really notice, right, when you switch. But it did, for me and my friends, right, we went from fall 2021 to winter 2022, online to in person, and it was a big difference in not just our passion for our classes, but also our grades. All of mine and my friends' grades went up, and we started going back in person. So I think it is much better in person for motivation and learning.
Stephen, how about on the instructor side? I'm sure you've given in-person and virtual presentations. How do they differ?
So, there's very different aspects of the environment that you can control or edit in physical versus online settings, right? So online settings, you might be worried about how you are presenting the content, whether you're able to share screen, whether you can see the faces of the people that you're teaching to on Zoom, how they can interact with you, whether they can chat with you, whether they can actually speak live to you, and so on. There's so many interesting and potentially configurable aspects of the online setting that could be very important for the degree to which a student may ultimately be engaged and the way the instructor can help try to promote that engagement. And then going back to this idea of being able to see the students, it's always recommended by our university to try to encourage students to turn on their cameras while in Zoom. But that usually, and I do that every course that I teach online. The very first week, I will ask students if they feel comfortable to turn on their cameras. But that doesn't seem to last very long. Now, in the in-person environment, to the extent that we can control it, in terms of, for instance, how the students are seated, how close are they to the instructor, how close are they to each other? Does that facilitate them being able to talk to one another, to collaborate? How closely they are paying attention to the lecturer? There are aspects of, even the lighting. You can darken the room to focus attention on the screen as opposed to allowing students to see each other and converse. There's so many things that may be subtle, but you can potentially configure, if you're allowed to, in the lecture hall that can potentially also affect the degree to which students are engaged and motivated to learn.
All right. And Stephany?
Yeah, I was a junior in undergrad when the pandemic hit, and I absolutely dreaded the online classes. I'm a very social person, and I just missed that. So I struggled a lot, but a lot of my peers didn't. They actually would rather kind of isolate themselves. They worked better that way, but I really struggled to just find a routine, right? But one of the things that come to mind when we are having this conversation about how physical and online environments reflect on learning, I hear a lot from professors at UT Austin that a lot of these students that went through the pandemic as their first 2 years of undergrad, they struggle a lot with closed books exams right now. They are just not used to that kind of shift, right? It's actually a shock to them that they now have to go to a physical space to take an exam without their notes, right? And that's an issue for learning. How much can you rely on your notes moving forward, right? And I think that especially with like AI and tools like that I feel like we're gonna see a similar issue later on down the line, where at what point or like what's the threshold that we should rely on some of those techniques and tools, and how does that affect learning long term, right? So I feel like we're still seeing some of these negative factors that the pandemic influenced educational settings and learning now, 4 years later. So yeah, definitely impacts motivation and learning.
I'll add just a couple of thoughts there. So one from my experience, I actually had a largely positive experience teaching my lectures online during the pandemic. So surprisingly so. And for me, my approach that I think the things that led to it being successful is that I tried to emulate an actual classroom as much as possible. So I extensively used the chat and I interacted, and I had a couple of TAs assigned to the chat to help process it. They did things like answer very simple clarification questions, which students would never ask in an actual lecture hall because it would be too embarrassing. But I also purposely engaged students. So an example is in social psychology, when we're talking about in-group and out-group characterizations, I would ask, what do you think are the 3 characteristics that describe a McMaster student? They would put into the chat. And then I would say, well, what are people saying? And say, well, Stephen thinks that McMaster students are conscientious, they have a future, they're ambitious. Great. And people love being called out and recognized. Then I said, what are the 3 characteristics that typify a student from Western? And they were not as complimentary. But students loved that type of interaction. And I also leveraged my TAs to act as a proxy for students in the class. And I had them even sometimes in competitions with each other. And students said they really looked forward to it. It felt sort of like, a live event. They had to be there. And the second thought I'll add is that we have a forthcoming paper that demonstrates that in a virtual environment, having your cameras on makes a difference. So we did manipulations where everyone's camera is on. People do much better than when everyone's camera is off, not surprisingly. But the other interesting thing is that we assigned some people to have their cameras off and some to have their cameras on. And the people with their cameras off did the worst. So it's almost like this kind of bystander effect. Like, like when you're at a faculty meeting and your camera's offline, you kind of think, well, everyone else is going to take care of this. So I don't really have to. I've heard some people do this. And I think it's the same thing in that scenario. When you have your camera off, but everyone else has their camera on, someone else is going to answer this question. Someone else is going to take care of this. So we have this forthcoming paper that you might find interesting and you could cite to your students. Okay, 4th question. We've been talking a lot about motivation, but devil's advocate, maybe we're overemphasizing things. Like, you know what? At the end of the day, there's stuff you just got to learn. There's just stuff you have to know. So what are the potential drawbacks or limitations of overly emphasizing motivation in education? And maybe we'll start with Arnav here.
Yeah, I think it's hard to teach motivation. I think it is something that sometimes students have to come to class with. And I think sometimes it's very possible that if a student comes to class already maybe unmotivated, trying to teach them to be motivated or kind of get them or force them to be motivated could have the opposite effect. And so I think it's possible to fall into that kind of trap of trying to teach motivation. But I think it is possible to sort of convey it. I think you can teach it indirectly rather than directly. And I think it's easier to teach motivation indirectly and kind of show students, like maybe they see other people in class being motivated, or maybe their friends are motivated, or maybe they see the professor being motivated. And I think that's a much better way to transfer it. But I think kind of explicitly talking about it, like you should be motivated to learn this class for these reasons, I think could have a potentially backfire.
Okay. And Stephen, how about as an instructor? What's your perspective?
Well, I view trying to intervene to enhance motivation as a potential means to an end. So we really should not lose focus that ultimately the goal of classroom instruction, at least in most cases, is to learn the content. And yes, motivation is important, but it is not the thing we should focus on at the expense of the actual learning that is occurring. And this question also reminds me of some classroom observations I've done. And there are cases where, and it actually ties to some comments made earlier, where I've observed same class taught in different ways. One, a gamified way that is aiming to improve motivation, and a more traditional way. And sure, the gamified way sometimes is more engaging and students are more motivated, but there comes a point where it is becomes too much of an end in of itself, and then the students are focused on winning the game and not necessarily learning as much. So I think that's an example of where the goal to improve motivation is coming at potentially the expense of the learning that needs to occur. So we do need to strike a balance, and we shouldn't focus on exclusively. And there's one more point I would make is when we talk about motivation, we might also consider certain interventions, for example, mindset interventions and so on. And some of those have I don't want to get too controversial about it, but some of those have a somewhat mixed track record. And so those are cases where we might be emphasizing ways to improve motivation that might not necessarily be as beneficial as focusing on, for example, other effective ways to enhance learning.
Okay. And Stephany?
Okay, so what I will say about this question is that, as I mentioned earlier, maybe as a teacher, as a professor, your role might be to be an accountable buddy, friend, not friend, but maybe a friend to your students. We are role models. They look up to the people that are teaching them so many interesting and valuable things. And one of the things that I think as a post-secondary student you should be focusing on is learning life skills, right? That you're going to be using to your job or maybe even your personal growth. And one of the things that I think is very important for us to teach students is that sometimes you're just going to have to do things that you don't like in order to succeed. So I do think that motivation is extremely important, but we also should be sending messages to students that, in life, that's just how it goes. We're going to have to do this assignment that it may feel boring, or you might not like it at first, or you might not like it at all, but it might be beneficial for your learning. And you just have to find the strength to do it.
Okay. And Mayu?
I certainly think overemphasizing anything is probably not a good thing to do. So in terms of overemphasizing motivation, I think of motivation as, a type of character trait. So how motivated are you for this thing? And so if we turn it around to students who are not really motivated in a particular class might start to internalize that as their fault. Like something's wrong with me because I'm not motivated with this course or with this content or even university that everyone says is so important. So I think, overemphasis can do that, at least for, but it also makes me think about like hearing everyone's responses is confusing me a little bit about what do we mean by motivation? Because it's so different what motivates you. So I think ideally we want students to be intrinsically motivated to learn, right? The thing that we want them to have. But you can also do a great job through school and work if you're motivated to, honor your family's values, right? Or to put food on the table. Like it doesn't have to be just for the love of learning per se. So maybe just that recognition of it doesn't have to be because you love the content or you love your identity as a student, but like just reflect on what motivates you to be here and leverage that. That will certainly help you. But it's okay that we all are motivated by different things. and that we're not always motivated to the same extent.
Yeah. And connecting to what Arnav said earlier, even if there are students in your class that will never go on to developmental psychology, seeing your passion for developmental psychology, I still think is a positive thing, even if they never take another course in it. Okay. Our final question to wrap things up. I want each of our panelists to give one bit of practical advice or interventions that they know works to boost motivation in their teaching. We'll start with Stephen, because you're thinking.
I do think that it's important to try to the extent you can, in large courses, this is not always easy, but to give students personalized feedback on their learning, whether it's giving them comments on their essays or trying to give them pointers to do better on exams, things that give them a sense that the instructor is trying to move them in a direction that helps them personally with their learning. And so when you do those kinds of things, that can help keep the student engaged in the course and potentially motivated to learn more effectively. That's my suggestion.
Stephany.
That's such a difficult question. When I think about this question, I think about motivation a little bit more broadly. So thinking about a classroom and a sense of belonging or community that classroom can enhance or create to students, that itself may motivate students to learn and be engaged more in the classroom. So my practical recommendation would be to, first day of class, try to build that sense of community. Try to encourage students to talk to one another, talk to the professor, just have that exchange become the norm of the classroom. So moving forward, they feel like they have a community that they are learning with and growing with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. On my very first class, several things that I do, I always start on time and I always use the entire class period so that they know we're going to be here. There's no rustling of papers. It has zero impact on me, and I will be asking questions. So I set that tone right from day one.
Yeah.
Mayu.
So again, then as a developmental psychologist, so I think all parents know that if you already show that you have ice cream and then try to convince your child that we're having carrot sticks for snacks, it's just not going to go well. So the parenting trick is let them choose. Would you rather have carrots or cucumbers for snacks today? And children feel empowered that they got to choose their snacks. So my practical strategy is I embed some choice into my assessments. Do you want to do this project or this project? It's your choice. And I think that students, I mean, they know that I'm intentionally building these choices in, but I also encourage explicitly that you're choosing your path, right? You're in control of your learning. And I think that messaging helps motivate them.
One thing I've noticed is that it's often really easy for students to lose motivation. And like something that I've done when I've taught tutorials and also that I've seen professors do is that when they get to like hard content or like, the tough weeks is to tell students, be like, hey, this upcoming week or this upcoming unit is really difficult. And it's okay if you struggle, like we're going to go through it together. Because I find that often myself and students, when they start struggling, they kind of internalize it and be like, oh, everyone else is probably doing fine. And it's just me who's not doing well, and that causes them to lose motivation. But then if you as a teacher are able to be like, no, this is normal, right? You're on the right path and you can like learn this and it's not difficult if you put in the effort, it really helps to kind of stop them from losing that motivation, I found.
Thank you, panelists, for a very thoughtful discussion to conclude our conference. And thank you to ChatGPT for helping me to draft these panel questions.